Tonight on Nation to Nation, the Prime Minister made a major announcement about a new way to recognize Indigenous rights and has given his government until the next election to get it done.
He's got to be careful about raising hopes that, possibly are just going to be dashed again. So this is a huge, complex initiative, and he's committed to it in 18 months.
Policy analyst Russ Diabo is troubled by the lack of meat on the bones of Trudeau's message.
I think the lack of time to respond, to react, is very concerning, and the lack of details in the announcement yesterday, very concerning.
Welcome to Nation to Nation. Hello, I'm Todd Lamarand. Yesterday, the Prime Minister announced a new framework to recognize Indigenous rights that will guide all government interactions. He said Indigenous rights have never been implemented, governments have not kept their word in the past, and progress on Aboriginal issues has not been sustained or significant. Here's a bit more of what he had to say.
A new recognition and implementation of Indigenous rights framework that will include new ways to recognize and implement Indigenous rights. This will include new recognition and implementation of rights legislation. Going forward, recognition of rights will guide all government interactions with Indigenous peoples.
The opposition urged caution. Both the Conservatives and NDP want the government to go beyond rhetoric and deliver actual results. And to hash it out, what it all may mean, I'm joined by our political panel of MPs. Dan Vandal, Chair of the Liberal Party's Indigenous Caucus, Cathy McLeod, Shadow Minister of Indigenous Affairs for the Conservative Party, and Georgina Jollybois, NDP MP from Saskatchewan. Welcome.
Good morning.
Now, Mr. Vandal, I'll start with you. What does this Indigenous framework mean, and how will it affect people's individual lives?
Well, essentially, everybody agrees that Section 35 protects Aboriginal rights, Aboriginal being Métis, First Nation, and Inuit. That was protected or implemented in the Constitution in 1982. But those rights have never been defined. So I see this framework of rights being doing the important work that has never been done since 1982 is to, first of all, consulting with Métis, First Nation, and Inuit people to actually identify those rights and protect them, identify them, and enshrine them through legislation. So that many people think Section 35 is a box full of rights. Other people think it's an empty box. So we are going to consult in partnership with Indigenous people, with territorial governments, with provincial governments, and with citizens to identify what those rights are and actually protect them through legislation. So the hope is that in the long term, that Indigenous communities will be challenging the government or bringing the government to court much less often.
Does this mean that the government will stop taking First Nations or Indigenous communities to court? I mean, for example, if a specific claims tribunal rules for First Nations, sometimes the government will appeal that.
The whole purpose of what we're doing is to spend less time in the courts and more time affirming and implementing Indigenous rights.
Ms. McLeod, in your speech last night, you talked a lot about the Conservative record on Indigenous affairs, but this seems to be more far-reaching than just matrimonial property rights or the First Nations Transparency Act.
So first of all, we do agree that the better clarity is important, but I think you have to listen to what the Prime Minister said. He committed to the full implementation of the UN Declaration. We just heard what the intention is with this, which is huge, it's complex. So you are going to be, and he committed to implementing legislation before the next election. So what he has said is he is going to have, not from national organizations, but from treaty and rights holders, free, prior, and informed consent, and introduce legislation into the House of Commons in 18 months. You look at, that is so complex. I mean, every single community, and according to Romeo Saganash, free, prior, and informed consent means every single community. So, I'll leave it to the people that are viewing this to say, is this achievable? Because that's what he's committed to. But second of all, he's got to be careful about raising hopes that, possibly are just going to be dashed again. So this is a huge, complex initiative. and he's committed to it in 18 months. And to be frank, I think the conversations with communities across this country. And on top of that, I mean, they committed to phase 2 of S3. No idea where that's at, but it's been a number of months. So I think there is some certain challenges ahead for sure.
Ms. Jolibois, I guess also the NDP wants to see something concrete. Ms. MacLeod brought up, yes, he did promise in 18 months to implement this. What happens if he doesn't? Is it just more empty rhetoric and Indigenous people are going to be disappointed once again?
Before I answer your question, I'd like to say I'm proud and honored to be working with Romeo Saganash, MP Romeo Saganash, who is the lead on the UN Declaration of the Human Rights. And yesterday, the Prime Minister did say that it will be fully implemented. Now, we on the NDP side are offering our support in working with the governing party. However, we are very cautious in proceeding with them because the citizens, the Indigenous people across Canada, and I'm really worried that the Prime Minister would have raised the hopes of Indigenous people, of leaders from First Nations, Inuit, and Métis across Canada. 18 months, it does worry me because in 18, the way the system works in Ottawa, it moves very slowly. And I am concerned that the hopes of Indigenous people may be raised again. And therefore, I hope the Prime Minister will move along, not slowly, but move along to make progress.
Mr. Vandal, some on social media have called this announcement meaningless if it doesn't include getting land back and access to resources. Can that be achieved with this framework?
Well, the first thing I want to say is that I also see this. UNDRIP's been mentioned a few times. We support UNDRIP 100%, but I think UNDRIP is a good foundational document, but it doesn't go far enough. We have to go further than what UNDRIP does. We have to actually implement some of the aspirational statements that UNDRIP espouses. So that is exactly what we're doing. We are trying to go further, and I think by getting land back, getting treaties signed and agreed upon, I think all begins with those rights. Treaty rights may be one of the rights clearly defined within Section 35. I think I'm not going to apologize for bringing hope to Canadians. I think that's part of our job, is to raise people's hopes. And I think
at the end.
No,
yes,
I think the second part of the job is to develop, is to implement and to deliver on the hope that's being delivered, especially after 10 years of a hopeless Stephen Harper government.
Really
they committed to free, prior, and informed consent. They just tabled 2 pieces of legislation in terms of the Fisheries Act and the Environmental Assessment Act. Neither one of them has free, prior, and informed consent. So, nor is the language even in those pieces of legislation. So again, you know, they say the words that people want to hear, but when they actually are tabling legislation or putting pen to paper, it's not there, and it's shameful.
I want to correct my colleague from the government side. My colleague Romeo Saganash worked endlessly and made sure that this piece of legislation on UN Declaration of Human Rights go further and challenge the government on all aspects of it. So on record, I like to say that this piece of legislation that the government is supporting is the piece that we've been waiting for in Canada.
I'm going back to you, Ms. MacLeod. You talked again about the difficulty of achieving reconciliation in your part of the speech last night. Could this this announcement falter in that regard, especially in the aftermath of the Gerald Stanley verdict?
You know, I think, and I want to go to one thing that I thought was really missing in terms of, you know, what the Prime Minister was doing, and that is economic reconciliation. And that is the ability to say, look at what's happening right now. Where are the barriers for communities to actually have self-sufficiency? It's important to clarify rights, but what they're forgetting about is the very important opportunities and abilities for communities to, you know, share in the natural riches of this country. And so, you know, I think that's something that I don't hear the government ever talking about. It's certainly an important part of reconciliation.
But could this all be in jeopardy because of the verdict? People are quite angry out there still. It's nearly a week and it's still on social media. Could this affect the ability to go forward?
You know, I think we're talking about a tragic situation and an anger over the judicial outcome, and a different thing in terms of the Prime Minister's statement. So, you know, obviously I think the government and all of us need to do whatever we can to try and, you know, the communities are suffering, and we need to do what we can to help the suffering in those communities.
Ms. Jollybaugh, when we talk about reconciliation, I've been in Ottawa for about a year. I've seen little small measures of it in day-to-day life here, but have we taken 2 steps back because of this verdict?
I certainly believe that we have taken not just 2 steps, but 3 steps backwards. Indigenous people in Saskatchewan, across Canada, are very, very afraid for their lives, afraid, and they don't feel safe. What the verdict has done is fuel tension, racial tension across Canada, and particularly in Saskatchewan. I disagree with both the Conservatives and the Liberals on this, where I hear from the constituents, I hear from Saskatchewan residents and other people across Canada how they feel that this verdict really puts the reconciliation in jeopardy, because if we don't correct it now, if we don't correct the systemic racism and the injustices that go on, we will never get the reconciliation going.
Mr. Vandel, if there are acquittals, let's say in the Cormier trial and the Bushby trial in Thunder Bay, how difficult is it going to get to have Indigenous people trust the justice system in this country?
Very difficult. In my own city, after the verdict last week, there were 1,500 people marching in the streets. Many, many young people. People are angry. People are frustrated, and I think it's important as leaders to acknowledge and recognize that anger and frustration with society and with the justice system in particular. It's clear if you've listened to the Prime Minister and Justice Minister Wilson-Raybould that they are embarking on a review of the justice system to try to modernize it, to try to eliminate any potential systemic discrimination that exists. And that's something that they're committed to. That's something that our government is committed to. And we want to do it in partnership with all Indigenous people, Métis, First Nation, and Inuit.
Ms. McLeod, any last words on this?
I think everyone just recognizes what a tragic situation, and certainly I think everyone in the House expressed their condolences to the family of Colton. Okay,
we're out of time. I want to thank you for this. Next week you go back to your constituencies and do some constituency work, so hopefully we'll see you again in a couple of weeks. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Coming up after the break, policy analyst Russ Diabo dissects the Prime Minister's announcement further. Welcome back to Nation to Nation. Before the break, we heard the political panel discuss the Prime Minister's announcement Wednesday. There was some doubt about what a legislative framework to recognize Indigenous rights means, and if this could be put into place before the next federal election in a year and a half. So let's see if we can put this in a broader perspective. And join me now is policy analyst Russ Diabo. Welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thank you.
Now, what did you think of the Prime Minister's announcement yesterday?
I think it had a lot in there, things I've never seen before, like replacing the comprehensive claims policy and the self-government policy. Those are huge. But the problem I have is that it's going to be framework legislation and policy. There's little details and little time to have input from the grassroots peoples into what it all means. Because as I understand it, from what I hear from explanations from ministers, who I heard recently following the speech, that it will be a mix of policy and legislation. And basically it'll be a framework, so that means it will define what's on the table for negotiation and what's not on the table for negotiation. And the problem I have with that is that it's interpreting the minimum standards in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. that doesn't really seem like self-determination to me. Even if they're saying they're not dictating to people what to negotiate, they're going to lay out a framework of, like I say, what they can negotiate and what they can't negotiate. So there's preconditions. And we don't know what they are yet because the Prime Minister didn't give us details, but that will be forthcoming. And I understand that legislation will be introduced this year, perhaps this session, and they want it operational by before the next election in 2019.
It seems like it's quite a tight time frame. I know Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Carolyn Bennett is supposed to lead this engagement process. I'm assuming we don't know yet what this engagement process is going to look like. Can anything be done in the time frame given?
Well, I think they already have it ready to go. I mean, they have a majority in Parliament, so they can push through whatever they want. They dominate the committee, so any presentations before the committee, the Liberal members will decide who the witnesses will be in that. So they can do it if they want. You know, they can ram it through.
Does this go contrary to, I suppose, Prime Minister Trudeau's promises to engage and consult before doing any of this kind of stuff?
He didn't engage and consult even with AFN, who they have a MOU with, on the 10 principles they issued in July, which are 10 principles for Indigenous relations, which in themselves are preconditions. And he didn't consult when he did a cabinet shuffle and split INAC, Indigenous Northern Affairs Canada, into two and created 2 ministers. AFN wasn't consulted, nobody was consulted. And to this day, from what I hear from chiefs, they don't have any idea what the division of the department into 2 new departments means. And that's very concerning.
Now, what happens to Romeo Saganash's Bill C-262?
From what I understand, well, I've always believed that the Liberal support was symbolic, you know, to support it, because they've always said they were going to introduce their own comprehensive legislation. Now with the Prime Minister's speech, his Valentine's Day speech, we know that it's true, that they're coming forward with legislation. So that will, it's a government bill, so that will take precedence, I think, over any bill. And Romeo Saganash's bill is not through Parliament yet. So, in fact, they may not support it all the way through.
Yeah, in fact, it just went to its first time in committee just a few days ago.
Yes. So it still has some steps to go through. The government may withdraw support of that at some point and say, we're supporting our bill. We don't know, but we'll see.
Because the Prime Minister did mention UNDRIP, and that this is an important part of this framework, is to implement that.
I believe that this is he will say that this is fulfilling his promise to implement UNDRIP, this rights recognition framework.
I suppose, can the framework lead to a way to getting territories or lands back and access to resources?
It doesn't seem like that. I think if you look at the text of the speech, it doesn't talk about going back into the past. He didn't even mention Constitution Act 1867. He didn't mention the white paper. You know, he had the opportunity to refute his father's white paper on Indian policy from 1969. I found that concerning. He started with the Constitution Act 1982. And so, you know, by not saying he's not going to, you know, continue on with the tenets of that paper, it's very concerning, because it seems to me a lot of this stuff's being done in secret. The Law and Policy Review, led by Minister Wilson-Raybould, is in secret. We don't know what's going on, except when they bring it out to the public. And that's in contrast to the Special Parliamentary Committee on Indian Self-Government back in 1982 and 83, headed by Keith Penner. That was an all-party committee. They had representatives of national Aboriginal organizations on there. They heard from witnesses across the country. You know, I would have thought that would have been a better approach, to hear from witnesses across Canada and some kind of committee like that on how they see the implementation of the UN Declaration. But that's not, it's a partisan approach that's being taken here.
I guess very quickly, Russ, if this actually, the government pulls this off, what can ordinary people on the ground expect from this?
It's going to last for generations. I mean, they've even said that their intent is to get it in before the next election, so that regardless of what happens in the next election, it'll be hard for the next government to undo it. And so it's something that we're facing that will last, you know, well, I'm a grandparent, it'll last beyond my grandchildren's time. So it's very serious. I think the lack of time to respond, to react, is very concerning, and the lack of details in the announcement yesterday very concerning.
On that note, I'm going to have to leave it then. Thank you for doing this,
Thank
Mr.
you for having me.
We'll be right back after another short break. Welcome back to Nation to Nation. For months now, the Senate Standing Committee on Aboriginal Affairs has been studying a new relationship between Canada and Indigenous people. The most recent meeting discussed reconciliation, as two of the three TRC commissioners, Senator Murray Sinclair and Marie Wilson, appeared as witnesses. Here's a little of their testimony.
Because I think there are lots of good intentions out there from people from any political stripe or color, but we don't necessarily see the action that we should be seeing as Indigenous peoples.
Is that if we have the political will to acknowledge that reconciliation and these pieces of urgent work are not partisan issues, then we don't have to throw out the baby with the bathwater every time we have a shift in government or a change of minister or a shuffle or an election to say, now what do we do? We have what I think is a long-term charted pathway of work and of building forward that should compel us all and that should bind us all and that should allow for continuation rather than perpetual startup and breaking.
I'm looking for some guidance from you and from anyone that's here on where do we go from here when we have tried to work with them as government to government, but they're refusing to acknowledge that relationship.
No hope in getting things changed. This was a common sentiment that we heard from many people, and to a certain extent, as commissioners, we would run across this feeling ourselves, and as part of our work, because we were getting inundated by so many stories from people who had experienced so much that we had did not expect to hear so many stories from so many people about what had happened to them, and such negativity around that. Even those who had never been abused told us about the sense of loss they felt over their loss of language and culture and their fear that they were next while they were in schools. So they would often say, government's never going to change. They're not going to do anything to help us. They're not going to do anything different. They've got us under the thumb, and therefore they're never going to let us out. And I found myself thinking through that very carefully, because it's a feeling that can pass through them into us as well, and cause us to wonder whether we were ever going to have any impact and have the right impact. And I'll tell you what gets me through it now and got me through it then, and that is the belief that you don't have to believe that reconciliation will happen. You have to believe that reconciliation must happen. That's what will get you through this.
The committee is set to hit the road next month, where it will travel to Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. It'll be interesting to hear what people think of a new relationship in that province right now. I'm Todd Lamoran. Have a great evening.